Now FNAF 6 has a ton of animatronics to look at, and so we are going to be splitting this into a 3-part series. Today I want to take a look at Trash in the Gang's models and the Mediocre Melodies models. So before we jump into the video, let's remind you on a vertex, face, and edge. A vertices is the point at which triangles will meet, or these guys right here. An edge is the lines that make up a triangle, so one triangle would have 3 individual edges. And a face, otherwise known as a tri, is just simply what you can imagine it is, the actual face of the triangle. And now that that's out of the way, I want to get into the video. And we're going to start off with Bucket Bob. This model has 14,079 faces and 28,084 edges. The cool thing about Trash in the Gang's models is they use very little polys, as they're very simplistic models. Pretty much made up of, as it says in the name, trash. At first I want to take a look at Bucket Bob's head. Now, this is not like any other animatronic we've seen before. I mean, it doesn't move, and it's very rudimentary. So rudimentary, in fact, that none of his actual facial features are modeled at all. It's just a simple texture that goes right over the bucket. And what's interesting about this model is if you take a close look at the handlebar here, you can also see that the face model goes all the way around the handlebar as well. This is probably something that the creator of this fan model just didn't know how to properly get rid of, which is alright, but I think it's an interesting little touch that you wouldn't normally see on the animatronic. There's also a bunch of torus shapes that are used to represent the rope that ties this animatronic's wood arms and legs together. You can see in the back there's a ton of clipping that goes on that you don't see in the front, and there's also some ropes that just kind of go around his wrist for some reason. They don't necessarily hold the glove on, as you can see there's really no interaction between the two, but it is interesting to see. The glove is also well modeled as well, but if you take a look on the inside you realize that it is very thin and does not actually connect to the wood part of the model. This model's hips are also held together by the same ropes and also by 2 little nails or screws or bolts, who's to say. And the fact that his arms and legs are just wood sticks makes this model very simple and probably made it pretty easy to model, as it's just a copy and paste of that same exact model. Up next we're going to move on to Mr. Can-Do. This model has 3,340 faces and 6,638 edges. Another very simple model and the lowest poly count we'll be looking at today. As you can see, this model is so simplistic that his arms are literally just 2 pieces of wood just sitting up next to the garbage can, not even actually connected at all. As we take a look at the garbage can too, the lid is tied to the rest of the balloon. And aside from the actual trash can itself, this might be one of the most complex things in the actual model. The string is straight going all the way up where it tapers off into a slight curl where it's not connected to anything else but the balloon. You can also see the spout from the balloon here that's just kind of funny to look at. I'm sure this is just a simple torus model, but it is required for that accurate balloon look. Just like Bucket Bob, Mr. Can-Do's face is also just a drawing, possessing no actual polys to it, and it's just a simple texture smacked onto the balloon. If you take a look at the bottom of the trash can, you can see it actually has a really interesting looking poly shape. A very nice, satisfying pattern that just kind of sits at the bottom. There's no other extra detail here, as this would be placed right on the ground, so there's no reason that Scott would have to put anything else underneath it. Up next we have Mr. Hugs. This model is made of 3,785 faces and 8,543 edges. Another very simple model, but slightly, ever so slightly, more than Mr. Can-Do. Taking a look at the bottom of this model, it's interesting that this model actually does not have anywhere that dirt or any other debris could be sucked up from, which is kind of strange as this is a vacuum and at one point should have been used as such. There's also a little bit of disconnect from the actual vacuum and the vacuum bag, meaning that if this was an operational vacuum, it would be spraying dust everywhere. Mr. Hugs has some of the best looking hands from any of the Trash in the Gang models, no doubt, and they also remain pretty clean. I assume if this was a real animatronic, this would be the most expensive part of the animatronic to buy. He also has his simple little eyes that sit right by the actual top of the vacuum, but one thing that's a little inaccurate about this fan model is that the eyes are set back a little too far. As you can see here, Mr. Hugs' eyes are in front of the handle, but in this fan model they are a little recessed. He also has this very strange handle that would be very uncomfortable to use if he was a real vacuum. These fins would most likely get in the way of your fingers if you were using this as a vacuum in your own house. And he also has this light on the front, which is actually a pretty interesting idea for a vacuum, and I think now some vacuums really do actually include this, but I don't think that a vacuum from, I'd assume, 1980s would have such technology like this. But I could be wrong, as I'm no vacuum expert. Up next we have number 1 crate. Now this is the heaviest poly count model in all of the actual Trash in the Gang models, sitting at 373,096 faces and 746,032 edges. I personally believe that if this was actually Scott's model, it wouldn't use this many polys. I think they went a bit overkill on the actual bars and base of the crate here. As you can see, there's so much poly work done on just the grate alone of the actual crate that I gotta say, it's a little bit too much. If you take a look at the handles though, they really undercut them on the polys used there, which is exactly how the rest of the model should look in my opinion. As we take a look at the bottom, you see that there is also a ton of polys here. Something that could have easily been covered by just 2 polys. Who's to say why they use so many on this? What does make sense though is the amount of polys used on the hands of number 1 crate, as this would be a pretty complex model to kind of make. A ton of curves and edges that you really don't see anywhere else in the model except for his eyes. There's no 3D poly work done on the actual decal of the hands, they're just another simple texture that are slapped onto it, which makes perfect sense as in real life no foam finger has any extending part for the most part. They're all usually just printed onto the foam hands. And just like Mr. Hugs, number 1 crate doesn't have a mouth either and only consists of a pair of eyes. Finally, we're gonna move on to the last trash in the gang animatronic, known as Pan Stan. This model sits at 16,974 faces and 33,809 edges. Now, this model has a ton in common with Bucket Bob. If you take a look at the ropes on Pan Stan, you can see they're almost exactly in the same places as Bucket Bob's. Around the wrists, around the hips, and around the shoulders as well. Although the wrist knots are a little bit differently skewed, and there's also a little bit extra rope holding Pan Stan's head right on. And just like Bucket Bob and Mr. Can Do, they also utilize just a texture for the face of this guy as well, as it's supposed to only be just another drawn on face. They were very conservative with the amount of polys used on the head, which honestly still looks really well done. This is the case for both the front and the back of Pan Stan's head. Another difference is in the hands. Pan Stan does not have nice hands by any means. It seems like they ran out of mittens when they made him because he only has 2 little nubs to represent his thumbs. I mean, at least they gave him that much, but still. They definitely started running out of stuff to use when they were making Pan Stan. However, to kind of give him a little bit more of a presentable look, they did add 2 little buttons on his chest, which are most likely made up of carriage bolts. Now we can get to some real animatronics, something that's not out of Dumpster Diver Weekly. And to start us off, let's take a look at Happy Frog. This model contains 30,184 faces and 53,690 edges. As we take a look at his chest, you could see there's a little bit of a rippled kind of plate that sits on top of it. I don't know how many frogs have this in real life, but it does add a nice little detail to this animatronic and gives it that amphibious look. Happy Frog's head is a lot fatter than any of the other previous animatronics we've ever seen in this game and has a very beautiful pink eye color. She also has giant flared nostrils that utilize a lot of polys to make it look as round and as well as possible. As you can see here, her eyelashes kind of disappear underneath her eyelids, which is definitely a little disturbing to take a look at up close, but it is something we have to look at. Happy Frog also does have this antenna at the top of her head with a big bright yellow circle on it at the tip. Who's to say if this is for communication or just for looks, but it is on the model and does not show up on any other Merry Melodies models. As we take a look at the battery here too, we see that it's a very simplistic model, aside from the wires that go up to the actual animatronic. All the Merry Melodies have this little battery, so we only need to take a look at it once realistically, so get a good look while you still can. As you can see, there's actually no tape or clamps on the actual battery prong, which is definitely a little dangerous and something you wouldn't want your kid around. Realistically, this battery wouldn't necessarily be that effective. Probably carries the same amount of energy as a car battery, which would not kill you. It still is a safety hazard, but not deadly by any means. That is assuming that this battery is a 12 volt. Happy Frog has 3 toes like a normal tree frog would, and has little yellow pads on the bottom of its feet, which again are frog accurate. Taking a look at the hands, we see that Happy Frog is the singer of the group as she's the only one to hold a microphone in her hand, and no other instrument. If we take a look at the inside of this endo, we can actually see that this is a very different endo look than any of the previous ones we've seen before, containing a lot of different colors, which is usually not seen in an endo. Who's to say if these are indicator lights or buttons, but they are present. And the top of the endo head is actually cut off, where most endos in the game actually had fully modeled heads. Up next, we're going to move on to Mr. Hippo. This model contains 54,908 faces and 82,796 edges. This model looks like it borrows a ton of aspects from Happy Frog, with very similar arms, legs, feet, but a slightly fatter torso, as a hippo would have. And if we take a look at that torso, we can see that Mr. Hippo has a little flower on his chest with a hole in the middle. I can assume that this might be to expel water like one of those little circus clowns do, but it is well modeled and looks very satisfying sitting there on Mr. Hippo's chest. Another difference is that Mr. Hippo also has 2 little buttons underneath that flower, which Happy Frog didn't have. However, like Happy Frog, Mr. Hippo also has pretty heavily detailed nostrils. And as we take a look at his ears, there's actually a hole in the middle of them, something that obviously no hippo really has in real life, but is a cute little design choice. He also has a hat very similar to Freddy Fazbear's hat, although it does appear a bit smaller on his head. However, Mr. Hippo's endo is significantly different from Happy Frog's, as it does have a fully modeled head, and no extras on the actual torso section. No green, blue, or red differentiating buttons on his chest. Up next, we're going to move on to Ned Bear, who has 58,852 faces and 115,196 edges. Now, obviously, this animatronic was supposed to be a ripoff of Freddy Fazbear in the canonical sense, and looks very similar, as you can tell. However, unlike Freddy Fazbear, who has a bow, Ned Bear has an actual tie, which might point out that Ned Bear might actually be a little bit better dressed to go hit a steakhouse. However, like Freddy Fazbear, his hat matches his tie. Just another little kick in the face to William Afton. However, unlike Freddy's hat, Ned Bear's hat does kind of spring off of his head, which is an interesting little detail, and something we've also never seen in Five Nights at Freddy's before. It does experience a little clipping through the hole in his head, but I mean, that is what it is. It might simply be because of the way I T-pose this animatronic, but it is something to point out. Also, somewhere during T-posing, I think I lost Freddy's right ear connection, which is kind of funny, but not something you actually see in the real model. You can also see here that one of Ned Bear's eyebrows is slightly raised. Ned Bear, like Fredbear, also only has 8 teeth, and they're much more rounded than the previous animatronic models we've looked at. His arms and legs look very similar to the rest of the animatronics, however his toes do look a little bit more rounded off. And like Happy Frog, he shares those same differentiating buttons on his chest. However, his endo skull is a little bit thinner than the rest, and also has a full forehead. Up next we have Pigpatch. This model contains 52,538 faces and 96,324 edges. Pigpatch has a giant pig snout, as he should, which is beautifully modeled, and uses a pretty good amount of polys on the actual nose, not that you can see it in the square wireframe here, and also has bright red rosy cheeks, just like the toy animatronics from FNAF 2, which we don't see on any of the other Merry Melodies. He also has very different teeth from any of the other Merry Melodies, as he only has 2 cylindrical teeth. This makes sense as it's what a hog or a pig would have, but is an interesting detail to point out again. He also does have 2 different eye colors, which is very different from the rest of the animatronics, being green and blue. I do like that addition though, as it adds a little bit more uncoordination to what a Pigpatch would be. And like a farm animal would, he plays the banjo, which is actually pretty well modeled. As we take a look here, there's a ton of poly work done on the strings, the bridges, and the overall actual drum of the banjo. As we climb our way up the neck of the banjo, we can see that, come the end, there is no tuning sticks to this banjo, which is not unlike a banjo, as some banjos back in the day really did not have any way to tune them, and were stuck in the key they were made in. Pigpatch also has a very thick belly, just like Mr. Hippo, but if I were to guess, I'd say even a bit bigger than Mr. Hippo, as a pig should be fat. He's also the only animatronic we've ever seen, as far as my knowledge, that has a belly button right smack dab on his belly. And if we take a look at his backside, you can see that his pigtail has a ton of detail, as it turns and loops and makes what would be a crumpled pigtail. His endo almost exactly resembles Ned Bear's, with the exact same torso and a very similar head shape, if not the exact same. And finally, the most expensive Merry Melody, Orville Elephant. He's the only animatronic that can't be found in Stan's budget tech, but instead is found in Rare Finds Auction, where he costs about 20 times the amount of a normal Merry Melody. As we take a look though, you can see why. This model is the most pristine and best looking out of any of the animatronics, and overall is my favorite. This model sits at 122,464 faces and 244,218 edges. Orville has a very long snout that covers a lot of his mouth and makes it so that he doesn't need a top set of teeth. It's got very nice rounds to it and sits perfectly right on the head of his face. Just like Mr. Hippo too, he also has the same flower on his chest, however it is color shifted to purple and pink. The similarities don't end there, as he also has the same 2 buttons that Mr. Hippo had, which leads to the conclusion that this might actually just be a recolor of Mr. Hippo's torso. On top of that, the arms, the legs, and the hands also remain very similar to Mr. Hippo's, except in Mr. Orville Elephant's hand, he does have a magic wand. This is because he's a magician, obviously, and might have performed magic tricks for the kids. However, unlike every other Merry Melodies animatronic, he has very different feet, looking exactly like how an elephant should look. Big cylindrical stampers with 3 toenails at the head. And just like an elephant should, he also has those big ears that look like they could be used for flying if they gave it enough speed. But we know realistically we'll never get him off the ground. He also has a really nice purple top hat, with a nice white ring around the base of it. And just like it would show in the flyers, Orville Elephant also comes with stars in the background. These are probably just simple little poly works, with only about 10 polys being used per star, so don't make up too much of the actual poly count of this animatronic, but they were included, so I decided to keep them in. As you peel back the skin, you also see he has the exact same torso as Happy Frog, and a very similar looking endo head to Happy Frog. However, his is actually completed all the way up to the top. One interesting thing about this animatronic though is his snout does have its very own endo arm, which would tie him up with Mangle for most arms in an endo. Other than that, that's all of the animatronic models we have to look at today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, leave a like. Next week we're going to be covering part 2 to FNAF 6, where we're going to be covering the high-end animatronics in FNAF 6's catalog. So hit that subscribe button if you're interested in taking a look at that video next week. But if you just can't wait to watch another video, luckily we have 5 more from the previous 5 games we've covered, so click one of them right here. Other than that, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.